Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Daniel, and today in this video we'll be covering a game, my round 5 game from the 2022 Eastern Action. This was another online event, and my online rating at the time was 1737. So let's take a look at what happened in the game. So I was playing black, and let's take a look. So we'll be looking at the full game since the game was relatively short. So knight f3, knight f6. So typically for me, when I face anything besides from e4, anything besides from white's opening move of e4, I usually, against anything else, I usually play the King's Indian setup with knight f6, knight f6, g6, d6, bishop g7, and castles. So you will see that that's the setup I employ here. So obviously against e4, I played d6 to prevent e5. d4, and now we actually transpose back into a King's Indian. Actually, this is the classical variation. So now e5, the idea is obviously if white plays d5, then I have knight d7 with a5 or even knight a6 to transfer into the nice c5 square. And the a5 move is very useful to prevent the b4 push by white. And obviously taking isn't good either because after all, not that move. After all of these trades, it seems like white wins a pawn by simply have knight takes e4, discovered attack, and I win back the piece. So here my opponent pushed forward with d5, the most common move. Knight d7, as I mentioned, idea is a5 and knight c5. Bishop to e3. And here I play this move b6. b6 isn't really good. At the time I hadn't really studied too much of theory. I just knew that I had to get in the a5 and knight c5 idea and have a strong post for my knight on the c5 square, which is why I played b6, because my thinking at the time was probably to support it with two pawns, the c5 square, so that when I pop my knight in, if they take, then I can play b takes, for example, and I have the open b file. But nowadays, if I get this type of position, I would just directly play knight to c5, or maybe even defend the e5 pawn first and then play knight to c5, because this double pawn structure is completely fine, because I know for black I can play knight e8 and knight to d6, which is a knight square, putting some pressure on a lot of pieces. So here b6, knight to d2, and here I play a5. I'm sort of setting up a kind of like a bind type of structure on the queen side, trying to mitigate the queen side play for white, because I know in the King's Indian, obviously black attacks on the king side with the king side pawns, and obviously white tries to create some queen side counterplay. So I create this sort of V-like structure in order to try to counteract any potential play for white on the queen side. a3, setting up b4, knight e8, setting up f5 in the future, castles, f5, f3, simply allowing white to have a square to drop back their bishop to, f4, closing it all down. Now this bishop is really nice. It puts some really nice influence on these squares, combined with the g4, h5 ideas in the future. Bishop f2, g5, pushing forward on the king side. White pushes forward on the queen side. Here, obviously, I won't react to any of these threats because I want to get my king side going in order to start an attack. Knight to b3, rook f6. Rook f6, my idea is to play rook to g6 or h6 to help support the g pawn and h pawn advancing. Here's c5, trying to break down the queen side structure. I take here because I calculated that after all of this, I actually ended up mitigating his queen side play. Although the queen side is relatively open, the king side is still pretty locked, and I can push forward with my pawns and continue with my attack. Rook g6. I picked the g file because that's where the king is. Bishop to b5. He's trying to land his bishop on this knight outpost on c6. Here I push forward with g4 because I had calculated here. This is actually the most critical moment. This is where I calculated the most amount of time. And I actually did end up finding the top engine move here, which is the move g4. As I had calculated that after g4, I have some very nice ideas if he plays bishop to c6. So g4, and sure enough, they play bishop to c6. And here, obviously, they're attacking the rook with this knight outpost square. Here, I played this really nice move. G takes f3, completely ignoring the threat on my rook, because I calculated that if you take the rook, then in fact you're going to get checkmated. After rook takes g2, king to h1, then I have this nice move, rook takes h2. If you come back, then I simply have queen to g5, followed by queen to g2 checkmate. And obviously, if you take the rook, then I have queen to h4 check, king to g1. Then I can simply weave my queen in, queen to g3, and after king to h1, then queen to g2 would be checkmate. So in fact, you cannot actually take this rook here successfully, as I would have the rook takes g2 idea, rook takes h2, and etc. So here he takes back with the queen, queen takes f3, and here I follow up with this other move that I calculated, bishop to g4. Bishop to g4 attacking the queen, and the queen is actually really short on squares. All of these squares are covered, in fact, because of the bishop. This square is covered by the pawn, and this square is obviously covered by the bishop. So in fact, and this square as well is covered by the pawn. So in fact, the queen only has two choices here. Both choices I calculated, they weren't really good. This choice is the easiest to calculate. Queen to d3 is outright not good because of rook takes c6, taking advantage of the pin here. And the other move was queen to f2. Queen to f2 didn't really look too good because I have bishop to h3, and my attack is actually breaking through. In fact, I think they have to sacrifice their queen. They could obviously play bishop takes a8. Then I believe after queen takes a8, I'm still breaking through here, and I think this is really favorable for me. So here my opponent actually picked the worst option, which is to play queen to d3. And obviously, as I mentioned, I take advantage of this pin. And in fact, I think my opponent here, it was round 5, so obviously it was the last round. I don't know if my opponent just gave up here or something, but here he ended up giving away his queen, and in a couple of moves, in fact, I consolidated, and here my opponent resigned, and I ended up winning this game. So pretty nice win in general. Nice attacking ideas in the King's Indian defense. I had managed to break through and find this really nice idea of g takes f3 here after the move bishop to c6. And it seems like my calculation did pay off, as I spent the most amount of time here. And in fact, the computer agrees with my thinking, so that's pretty good to know. And yeah, in general, it was a pretty smooth game. I managed to mitigate the queenside pressure that white put on. And despite my not so great move of b6, it still ended up working out in the end because I still managed to mitigate white's queenside counterplay. So in general, a pretty smooth game. Also, this was against a high-rated opponent, so it was a pretty good win against a high-rated opponent. I managed to show that I do have some understanding in the King's Indian defense, but it could still be improved. And yeah, that's about it. Hope you all enjoyed. Thanks for watching.